morning, YouTube. Sean here with Saul Good, and today we're going to be talking about the first colony on this side of the Delaware River, and arguably where the colony where Philadelphia and especially Delaware County began. It's called New Sweden, and I'm not sure how many people around here, at least Delco natives, I don't know if people realize that Philly and Delaware County was founded by the Swedes. A lot of people think it was the Dutch, and that's not quite true. It was actually the Swedes. And the colony where the Swedes founded Philly and Delaware County was called New Sweden, and it actually still kind of exists, as you can see. Now, obviously, these cabins are reconstructions of the originals, but they're pretty close. They're very accurate, and they are on this field, and this playground does represent, it is exactly where the Swedish colony was. And this exhibit is very well done. Like, there are signs everywhere that are telling the story, and the signs are going into a lot more detail than what I'm going to go into here. But so you should come here if you want to know. But essentially, I am right now very close to the airport. The airport's like that way, and maybe you can see airplanes taking off behind me. There's one right there. Yep. It's taking off from the airport. And if any locals are watching this means you know that I am in Tinicum Township. And Tinicum is a later name of the area where New Sweden was founded. So let's get into it. New Sweden. What the heck? Right? So New Sweden was, just to give a brief introduction. Now, I guess I should actually start by saying I know a little bit about this, only because, or I know a little extra than most people, only because I actually lived in Sweden for a little while, like 2 years, depending on how you do the math, about 2 years. And at that time, I learned a lot about Swedish history, and I was very surprised to learn while I was standing in a Swedish museum in Stockholm. I was in an exhibit about Gustavus Adolphus the Great. And Gustavus Adolphus the Great was a major Swedish emperor. Oh, I'm sorry, there's someone banging on something. It almost sounds like gunshots, but I think they're just banging on stuff. There's a lot of weird, there's a Holiday Inn Express here, and lots of random strange hotels near the airport where who knows what happens. But anyway, to continue, Gustavus Adolphus the Great basically set up the Swedish Empire to be one of the great powers during the great power period of colonialist history. But the thing is, Sweden didn't have any colonies, and when he died, he left all the power to his daughter, which, if you've watched Game of Thrones or know anything about how succession works in old empires with kings and queens, you know that when a child is put on the throne, that usually means that all the advisors are actually the ones who are in power, and that's exactly what happened. And the advisors set up a company. And when I say company, I mean company in the old sense. This was a cooperation, which is where we get the word corporation, I believe. But it was a cooperation between the government of Sweden and businessmen, and they decided to set up this colony. Now, here's the thing: the the Swedish knew that the Dutch had a colony here, but there was one guy. Let me see if I can remember his name. I want to say it's Meunier. I think sometimes people pronounce it Mugnot or Mugnot. Now this guy was Belgian, but he was Dutch technically, even though he was Belgian. He worked for the Dutch, and the Dutch West Indian Company was very successful in setting up Dutch colonies in the Americas, and so Meunier had the background to set up a competing colony. And when the Dutch pissed him off somehow, or basically fired him, he went straight to the Swedes, who were the allies of the Dutch, and he told the Swedes, hey, let's set up our own colony, and I know how to do it because I'm Dutch myself. I'll help you Swedish people set up your own colony, and we can get back at the Dutch. And at this time, basically the Dutch had set up across the river, like basically that side of the Delaware they set up across the river on the east side, because they'd come across from New Jersey, I believe, or at least it was easier for them to supply, trade goods from the interior of Pennsylvania. They could cross the Delaware and then run supply lines to the coast. And Meunier knew this, and he knew that if the Swedish could set up a colony across the Delaware on the west side of the Delaware, that they could front run the Dutch in the fur trade. So that's what they did. And Meunier snuck a boat up the Delaware and founded New Christiania. New Christiania was the name of the little girl, Gustavus Adolphus the Great's daughter, who sat on the throne as Queen of Sweden. And so New Christiania is now Wilmington, Delaware. And for a while, Wilmington was, the main Swedish colony, but it wasn't doing super well. And I don't know the details of the history, but at some point, I think the Dutch or the Swedes got into a war, and something happened, and the Swedes decided they needed to send a new governor. Meunier was out. I think he just disappeared in a boat accident. His ship sank somewhere. Something happened. He was gone. And then the Swedes, gosh, this banging noise is so loud. Really random. But then the Swedes, kind of fitting, it's almost like cannons. So just imagine these are gunshots and cannons from the colonies instead of someone banging on something. I don't know. Anyway, so the Swedish, these bureaucrats and other sorts of business owners and admirals and all the Swedish aristocracy, they decided to they needed to send a new governor over to rule the colony. And man, they chose this guy named Prince. Johann Prince. And this guy was a character. He was not a good person. He was a bad man. He, first of all, as far as I know it, he was in some disrepute with the Swedish government because during the 30 Years' War, he had abandoned a fort in northern Germany or something. I don't know, or somewhere where the Swedes were fighting. And so he was seen as a bit of a coward and a wayward officer who needed to rehab his reputation. And so the Swedish government sort of were like, all right, send this guy to the colony. No one else wants to go over to that miserable colony anyway. Send this guy over and, make him pay his dues. And that's what they did. So I'll stop here and get back to you, but here, check this out. Just check out this little village real quick. So this is what New Sweden looks like now. These are all reconstructions of cabins. but it's probably pretty accurate in some sense. Actual historians can correct me, but here's what you can pause and read that if you want. All right, now before we get to the main event, I do want to say a few things. First of all, the colony of New Sweden was technically actually founded, if you think about it, by the Swedes, or by the Finnish, because the Finns were here. The Swedish had sent over a bunch of Finnish people to work on the land, so they had sort of set things up, as far as I understand. But let me, yeah, and then the other thing to say is that this guy, Johan Prince, he was, when he showed up, so he landed here in 1643 in a boat with his wife and 5 daughters, which was a bold move considering most of the colony at that time was probably men. And he was notable for 2 things. First, apparently he had startlingly blue eyes. That was very unusual. And then, as you'll see, I'll show you a very, you know, I think this is a very generous rendition of him. There he is. It's a statue of Johan Prince. And if you'll notice one thing about him is he seems to be a little portly, if you will. He was not a slim man. Now, from what I can tell, I remember hearing the number 330 pounds. I've also heard upwards of 400 pounds, which I find a little hard to believe. But clearly this man was a large man, which was very unusual at the time. And I think it's possible that he was a contender for the heaviest man in America at the time, or at least the most obese, overweight man in America. And he settled here and he founded New Sweden, which arguably became Philly. So you could say that Philly was founded by the fattest man in America. You could say that. That's a little interesting tidbit. Ironic that the Nordics are now known for Ozempic, although that's technically the Danish from Novo Nordisk, I believe. Anyway, so I'm a medical editor, so I think about those things. It's kind of ironic. The first man here was very obese, and now they're known for weight loss. Anyway, so he settled here, and he was not a good person. He was dictatorial. He, unlike the English and the Dutch, the Swedes gave him they gave him full power. So he was an authoritarian figure here. The Dutch, they had to report back to their government in the Netherlands across the Atlantic. So they didn't have the, Stuyvesant, however you say his name, the governor of New Amsterdam up in New York. He didn't have full control over his colony quite the way this guy did. This prince had full control. So he ruled with an iron fist. People didn't like him. But that's how it goes. And in 1653, he was kicked out. So he left in shame, more or less. I think there's a story of the colonists at some point rebelled against him, and he was locked in the Princehof. The Princehof was the building he built for himself. It was basically his mansion. And I think the foundations are right behind these bushes. And the Princehof was technically the first state house in America, I believe. So that's a little important tidbit. Very important building, first state house in Pennsylvania, at least. And he got locked in there by his after being cornered by his fellow colonists for being such a bad ruler. And I think he eventually figured his way out of that situation, caught up with the leader, and executed him. At which point he pretty much had lost most of the favor that he had, if he had any, when he showed up. And at some point, the Swedish government in Sweden got into a big war in Europe and sort of forgot about this colony. So they stopped sending ships with more goods and stuff that the colonists would have needed to survive here. And the colony was essentially abandoned. Now, one thing is that there were a lot of natives in this area, right? So the Native Americans, they had a very tough relationship with the colonists. Governor Prince had a mandate to Christianize them. He also had a mandate to expand trade with the Indians, specifically the Lenape. But Governor Prince was basically a genocidal maniac, as I get the sense that most colonists were back then. He was a genocidal maniac who believed that the only way forward for the Indians was to ethnically cleanse them. And when I say that, I mean very, very bluntly. Prince, he's on record, there are quotes of him saying essentially that the only way to deal with the Lenape Indians was to kill all of the elderly folk and then assimilate the children into Christianity and essentially erase their culture. And then they would be Christian and their souls would be saved. So that was his policy, and it was pretty brutal. He kind of sucked as a person, in my opinion. And then he got kicked out for being a bad ruler and went tail tucked back up to New Amsterdam to hitch a ride back to Sweden with the Dutch. And he died fat and happy in Sweden sometime later in the I don't even know when. So that's essentially the story of Prince, of Governor Prince, the first founder of Philly, founder of Delaware County. There he is. And woohoo, right? So Alright, so this storm is really getting going. There's a little bits of hail coming down. This is very much what the settlers would have encountered when they first got here in February of 1643, which is 382, I think, if my mental math is correct, 382 years ago. They came here basically at this time of year. It was very cold, and they were welcomed by a small welcoming party of Finnish and Native Americans who were here. Now, one other thing I want to say is the Native Americans had set up villages up the creeks, and because Governor Prince had a mandate to go make trade with them, he sent explorers up the creeks from Tinicum. From this spot, he sent people to go establish trade routes, and he met with the Minkus, who were the Susquehannocks, and he went up the Minkus Path, where he sent people up the Great Minkus Path out to Lancaster area to chat with the Susquehannock on the Susquehanna River, make trade with them. He established relations with the Lenape, but of course was pretty brutal with them, as I mentioned. And the Lenape attacked Swedish colonists and tried to kick them out. Were unsuccessful, but eventually the Swedes did leave and were then later, essentially taken over by the English 40 years later when William Penn showed up. Now, one of the main things that the Swedish colonists did was they cultivated tobacco. And when Prince abandoned this colony and went back to Sweden in failure, he did leave the colonists who remained with some chance of survival, because he, first of all, he left his daughter here, so that he could say he didn't fully abandon this colony, but he kind of did. Then the other thing that he did was he left I believe I might get this part wrong, but he either left a slave here, or when he arrived with a slave. That actually might be what it is. He arrived with a slave who knew how to cultivate tobacco and was a tobacco expert or tobacco master, or they had some word for him that made it sound like he was maybe not a slave, but he was a slave, and then I think they freed him so that he could teach the colonists how to grow and harvest tobacco. So that's what I know about the history of slavery in this area. I don't think slavery was, from what I can tell, it wasn't like a big part of the early colony of New Sweden's culture. Like the Swedish didn't really have a big slave trade, at least not here. But there was that one slave, and I did want to mention him because whoever that person was taught the colonists how to grow tobacco, and that really kept them afloat when they got here. So yeah, just a quick mention of that person. And then, we'll just finish by saying this is really where the colonization of Pennsylvania began. And when Governor Prince arrived, before he arrived, the capital of New Sweden was New Christiana, which is Wilmington, Delaware, just down the river that way. And then he moved the capital upriver to this location at Tinicum. And that relationship between Philadelphia and Wilmington, it may help explain to locals why Delaware and Pennsylvania have such a close relationship. Delaware was essentially grafted onto Pennsylvania because of the way this place was colonized. There goes you can hear the airplane. Can't see it in the clouds, but it was there. So yeah, there's that strange sort of, Delaware, when William Penn finally showed up 40 years after New Sweden, he got Pennsylvania as a territory, and with Pennsylvania came the Delaware territory, or Delaware tract of land, which William Penn didn't really know what to do with. So eventually he got rid of it, and Delaware became its own colony. But for a while it was part of New Sweden. And then the other interesting geographic feature is that, I mentioned Stuyvesant. He was the governor of New Amsterdam, which is now New York. And New York and Philly have always had a bit of a fraught relationship. And it extends. That sort of strange relationship between New York and Philadelphia extends all the way back to the very founding of Philadelphia and the founding of Delaware County, this part of the world. So, okay, yep, I think I'll leave it there. I think I've covered the big points. Just, I don't think people realize that the Swedes had such an instrumental role to play in founding America. You could argue that a lot of, I think like 5 or 6 colonies were founded by the Swedes, founded by the Dutch. But especially Pennsylvania. The first people here were Finnish, Swedish, and they began the genocide of the true first people, the Lenape. Actually, I wanted to mention that I'm learning more as I'm making these videos, and I'm learning that the term Lenape is actually a bit redundant. Lene means original, and Lenape means original people. And apparently the Lenape preferred to be called just simply Lenape. So I want to thank the Lenape ancestors I'm walking in their path. I don't see any birds that are watching over us at the moment, but they're here and I feel their presence and I acknowledge them. Thank you, and we'll try to do right by them by telling the Lenape story. And Governor Prince is one of the great antagonists of the Lenape, and he began what I consider to be one of the great tragedies of American history, which is wiping out the original people of the southeast Pennsylvania. And I'm here to try to fix in some small way what has been lost of our legacy as Delaware County, Delco people. Also, it's Big Eagles game coming up, so go Birds. I'm Sean. This is All Good. Thank you for tuning in. I'm going to be doing a lot more of these kinds of videos. And I hope you all enjoy the game and the beautiful Sunday weather in this typical winter day in Pennsylvania. And we'll cover more strange places in Pennsylvania that people don't know about in another video. So yeah, hope this was informative. Take care. Bye.